Get your box off my block. Look at her, broke and sleeping in trash. Nobody wants you here, Grandma.
You should walk away.
Trevor Hollins didn't say a word when he first walked up. He just kicked. His boot caught the edge of the cardboard box so hard, it spun sideways and slammed into the brick wall blanket paperback, a Ziploc bag with a folded flag inside all of it, hitting the Harlow Street sidewalk like garbage being sorted at a dump. Then he crouched down, grabbed the woman's coffee cup right out of her hand, and poured what was left of it onto the concrete in front of her feet. He straightened up, smiled. Look at this. A homeless black woman setting up camp in front of my block. He spread his arms wide, glancing back at his crew. What is this, a shelter now? You think because nobody wants you anywhere else, you can just plant yourself here? Damon stepped up beside him, nudging the scattered blanket with his shoe like it was roadkill. Smell that. Damon wrinkled his nose, waving his hand in front of his face dramatically. That's what failure smells like, boys. 50-something years old, black, broke, and sleeping in a box. What exactly did you do with your life, Grandma? The crew laughed. Loud. The kind of laugh designed to humiliate, not because anything was funny. Trevor wasn't done. He leaned down until his face was level with hers, close enough that she could feel his breath. My grandfather used to say some people are just born to be at the bottom. Looking at you right now. He clicked his tongue slowly. I think the old man was right. The woman didn't flinch, didn't look up, didn't make a sound. What Trevor didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she had heard far more terrifying things. In places he would never survive a single night. Drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? And if you want to see the moment this man finds out exactly who he just put his hands on, make sure you're subscribed. Because what happens next stopped everyone on that street cold. Hey y'all, I've gotten lost more times than I can count, but somehow every wrong turn led me to the right person. Sit down with me. Harlow Street woke up the same way it always did, slowly, reluctantly. Like a man who'd been working double shifts for 30 years and had long since stopped expecting anything good from mornings. The block ran 6 storefronts long on the east side of Decatur, Georgia, a stretch of cracked sidewalk and faded awnings wedged between a check-cashing place that never seemed to close, and a vacant lot where someone had started building something 3 years ago and simply stopped. There was a nail salon with hand-painted letters on the window, a barber shop with a broken pole that still spun anyway out of habit or stubbornness, nobody was quite sure which. A small laundromat that smelled like fabric softener and old arguments. And at the far end, anchoring the block like a cornerstone, Patrice Nguyen's diner. Patrice's place with its yellow curtains and its handwritten menu board, and the smell of coffee that started at 5 in the morning and didn't stop until 10 at night. It was the kind of block that people from other parts of Decatur drove past without slowing down. The people who lived and worked on it knew better. Vivienne Carter had been sleeping behind Patrice's place for 14 months. Her spot was a narrow strip of concrete tucked under the diner's rear overhang, sheltered on 3 sides back wall dumpster and a section of chain-link fence thick with old vines. It wasn't invisible, but it was dry, and in 14 months on the street, Vivienne had learned that dry was the thing that kept you alive when nothing else was going right. She was 54 years old, 5'8", lean in the way that comes not from vanity, but from a life that had burned through everything unnecessary and left only what was load-bearing. Her hair had gone fully silver somewhere around her 49th year, and she kept it close-cropped out of habit, the same habit that made her fold her blanket every morning with hospital corners, stack her belongings in the same order every single day, and rise at exactly 5:30 regardless of how the night had gone. Old habits from old lives. 22 years, United States Army. She had enlisted at 20 because the alternative was staying in a town in rural Mississippi, where the options for a young black woman with no money and no connections narrowed to a vanishing point by age 25. The Army had not been kind exactly, but it had been honest. It told you what it wanted. It told you what it would cost. And if you met the standard, it didn't particularly care where you came from or what you looked like getting there. Vivienne met every standard they put in front of her. And then she went looking for harder ones. She was among the first women to complete Ranger School when the program opened to female candidates. That was 2001. She was 29 years old, and she finished the 61-day course 8 pounds lighter than she started, with 2 stress fractures in her left foot that she hadn't mentioned to anyone until after graduation. Her commanding officer at the time, a colonel named James Whitmore, had looked at her evaluation sheet, looked at her, and said simply, "Carter, you are going to be a problem for the enemy." He was right. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, a Bronze Star for actions in Kunar Province in 2009, where she had held a defensive position under fire for 40 minutes alone, while the rest of her unit extracted 2 wounded soldiers from a collapsed structure. She had been hit twice, once in the left shoulder, once across the right thigh. She had not left that position. The flag in the Ziploc bag, now scattered across Harlow Street sidewalk, was the one they had given her at her retirement ceremony in 2018. She had carried it in her bag every day since. What came after retirement came fast and came hard, the way losses tend to when they arrive in groups. Her husband, Robert, 21 years, married a quiet man who taught middle school history and made the best cornbread she had ever eaten, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March of 2019. He was gone by October. The medical bills were staggering, $186,000 after insurance, and the insurance had fought every single line item with the focused hostility of an organization that viewed her grief as a negotiating position. The house went. The savings went. The VA benefits she was entitled to got tangled in a bureaucratic delay that stretched to 18 months, a processing error, they said, as if that explained anything. The PTSD, which she had managed for years through structure and discipline, and sheer refusal to acknowledge it as something that owned her, found its opening in the wreckage of all that loss. It walked through the door she hadn't known was unlocked. She lost the private security job in the spring of 2022. Not because she did anything wrong, because she missed 3 shifts in 2 weeks when the nightmares stopped letting her sleep, and the company had a policy, and the policy didn't care about Kunar Province or Bronze Stars or 22 years. 14 months later, she was on Harlow Street. Every morning at 5:30, she rose, folded her blanket, and stacked her belongings. Every morning, old Earl, 68 years old, a black man with a white beard, and the unhurried patience of someone who had already survived everything he used to be afraid of, would be sitting on the milk crate 10 feet away, and he would nod, and she would nod back. That was their whole conversation most mornings. It was enough. Patrice Nguyen appeared at the diner's back door at 6 with 2 cups of coffee. She had done it every morning for over a year. Not out of pity, Vivienne would have refused pity, but because, as Patrice once explained to her nephew who asked why she bothered, "That woman has kept 3 different people from breaking my back window in the middle of the night. The least I can do is make her coffee." This morning, Patrice set the cups down on the edge of the loading dock and went back inside without saying anything. Vivienne picked hers up. She sat with her back against the wall, both hands wrapped around the warmth, watching the light change over the rooftops. At 8:15, she heard boots on the sidewalk out front. She recognized the rhythm before she saw the face. Trevor Hollins ran 3 blocks on Harlow Street. Not officially. There was no deed, no contract, no ordinance with his name on it. But for the past 2 years, the east side of this block had operated according to his preferences, his schedule and his tolerance level, and his tolerance for Vivienne Carter sleeping under Patrice's overhang had reached its end. It wasn't personal exactly. It was architectural. He had decided that the block needed to look a certain way, project a certain kind of energy, and a 54-year-old black woman in army surplus clothing, sitting on the sidewalk with a cardboard box, did not fit the image he was building. That was how he explained it to Damon the night before. Damon had nodded. Kashawn, the youngest of the three, had stared at his shoes. Trevor came around the front of the building at 8:17. He saw Vivienne sitting in her usual spot, coffee in hand, back against the wall, watching the street, with the focused stillness of someone who spent a lot of time watching things without being watched back. He recognized the posture vaguely in the way that someone recognizes a word in a foreign language, enough to know it means something, not enough to know exactly what. He walked straight up and kicked the cardboard box. The sound it made was loud, satisfying to him, violent in the way that small displays of power always are designed not just to damage but to communicate. I can do this. I just did. What are you going to do about it? Vivienne's coffee cup was in her hand. He took it from her, poured it out on the concrete. He delivered his lines. Damon delivered his. The crew laughed on cue. Vivienne said nothing. She sat exactly as she had been sitting, both hands now empty in her lap, eyes resting on a fixed point somewhere at the middle distance, not at Trevor, not at the spilled coffee, not at the scattered belongings. The expression on her face was one that the men in front of her did not have a category for, so they filled in the blank with the nearest available assumption that she was afraid, and the stillness was fear, and fear was what they were looking for. They were wrong, but they did not know that yet. Trevor nudged her foot with his boot, not a kick, a dismissal. The gesture of a man who has decided something is beneath him and wants to make sure that thing knows it. You hear me talking to you, old lady? I said I want you gone. Vivienne looked up. It was the first time she had looked directly at any of them, and the effect was immediate and strange, a flicker of something in Trevor's chest that he could not have named, a half-second of internal recalibration. Her eyes were dark and utterly unhurried. There was no fear in them, no anger either. What was there was worse in some ways than either of those things. It was the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who is assessing a situation rather than reacting to it. Someone running numbers, someone deciding. Trevor covered the flicker by leaning in closer. I've moved bigger problems than you, he said, quieter now, the way men get quiet when they want something to land. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. At the far end of the block, the number 7 bus had just pulled to the curb. Among the students waiting to board was Mia Torres, 17 years old, junior at Towers High School, running 4 minutes late as usual. She had her earbuds in and her phone half raised to check a notification when she processed what she was seeing across the street. She pulled the left earbud out. She raised the phone the rest of the way up. She pressed record. Back at the diner's entrance, Patrice Nguyen had come out through the front door with a dish towel over her shoulder, alerted by the noise. She took one look at the scene and stepped forward. Hey, she's not bothering anyone, Trevor. Just leave her, so. Stay in your lane, Trevor said without turning around. His voice was flat and final. This doesn't involve you. Patrice stopped. She knew better than to push. She had learned across 11 months of paying $400 a month in what Trevor called a neighborhood maintenance fee exactly where the line was and what happened when you crossed it. She stood in the doorway. She did not go back inside. Damon picked up Vivienne's bag, the worn black duffel that held everything she owned, and threw it into the gutter. It hit with a dull, wet sound. The Ziploc bag with the folded flag skidded out onto the asphalt. Let's try this again, Damon said. Get up and get gone. And then Vivienne stood up. She did it slowly. The way she did everything with complete economy of motion, no wasted energy, no performance. She rose to her full height, adjusted the collar of her jacket, and looked at Damon for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at Trevor. "Son," she said. Her voice was low, conversational, the register of someone who was not competing for volume because they didn't need to. "I'm going to tell you one time." Trevor blinked. Then the grin came back. "Yeah, tell me what." "Walk away," Vivienne said, "while you still can." The crew erupted. Damon put his hands on his knees, laughing. Trevor shook his head like he'd just heard the best joke of the week. Kashawn didn't laugh. He was looking at the woman standing in front of them, at the way she was standing, the angle of her shoulders, the position of her feet, and something cold and instinctive moved through him that he could not explain. He almost said something. He didn't. Trevor cracked his knuckles and nodded at Damon. Damon raised his hand. Vivienne didn't step back. Damon's hand came forward fast and flat, not a punch, a shove, the kind that's designed to send a message rather than cause damage. His palm connected with Vivienne's left shoulder with full force behind it. She moved one step, just one. Left foot sliding back precisely 6 inches, weight, redistributed center of gravity, dropping almost imperceptibly. She absorbed the force the way a seawall absorbs a wave, not by resisting it blindly, but by having been built for exactly this. She was back in position before Damon had finished following through. He stared at her. Something shifted in the air on that sidewalk. Not dramatically, there was no gasp from the crew, no sudden silence. But Damon's expression changed in a way that was small and involuntary. A downward adjustment in confidence too quick to catch and too real to deny. He had pushed people before. People moved. People stumbled. People grabbed a wall or sat down hard or put their hands up. They did not simply absorb it and look back at him the way this woman was looking at him right now. He covered it by escalating. "You think that's funny?" His voice went up. "You think you're tough? You're a homeless woman, lady. You got nothing? You are nothing." Vivienne said nothing. 10 feet away, old Earl had been watching from his milk crate with the careful stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago that drawing attention to yourself when trouble was moving nearby was how trouble found you next. But when Damon took a step toward Vivienne again, Earl stood up. He was 68 years old and moved like it slowly with the particular carefulness of a body that had absorbed too many hard years and knew it. He raised one hand, palm out. "Hey now," Earl said. Quiet, not aggressive, just present. "That's enough. That's enough, son. Just leave her be." Trevor didn't look at Earl when he moved. He just extended his arm sideways and shoved the same flat-palmed dismissal he'd used with Patrice earlier, except Earl was 68 and on his feet on uneven sidewalk and not braced for anything. Earl went down, not dramatically, not all at once. His right knee gave first, then his hip clipped the edge of the milk crate, and he went down to the concrete in the slow, awful way that older bodies fall, without the reflexes, to catch themselves taking the full impact. On the side of his hand and his elbow, the sound of it, sharp and wrong against the morning air. Patrice screamed. Not words, just the raw, involuntary sound that comes out of a person when they watch something happen that they cannot stop. She had her phone out of her apron pocket before Earl had finished hitting the ground. "I'm calling 911?" Her voice was shaking, but loud enough to carry to the end of the block. "I am calling right now, everybody back up. Chakuchu. Call whoever you want," Trevor said, and his voice had changed. The performance quality was gone. What was underneath it was harder and colder and less interested in being watched. See how fast they come to Harlow Street. Across the street, Mia Torres had stopped breathing. She was still recording. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by that, surprised that the thing keeping her hands from shaking was the specific focused act of making sure she kept the frame right, kept all of them in, it didn't drop the angle. She had taken a single journalism elective last semester. The teacher, Miss Okafor, had told them, if something is happening and you have the ability to document it, that is a responsibility, not a choice. Mia was documenting it. The live stream counter in the corner of her screen read 61 viewers. She had no idea. She hadn't looked. Vivienne had looked at Earl when he fell. Only for a second, a single rapid assessment checking his position, the way he landed, whether he was moving. Earl was pushing himself up onto one elbow, his face creased in pain, but conscious, present. Alive. She looked back at Trevor. Something had changed in her expression. The assessing quality was still there. It never fully left. But underneath it now was something that had not been there before. A decision that had been pending and was now made. The particular stillness of a closed door. She reached down and picked up her duffel bag from the gutter. She pulled the Ziploc bag from the asphalt, tucked it inside. She slung the duffel over her left shoulder and straightened up. Trevor watched her do it with the expression of a man who had misread a situation and was still catching up to that fact. Where do you think you're? I'm not going anywhere, Vivienne said. She said it simply, without heat. The way you state a fact about weather or geography. Trevor's jaw tightened. He took one step toward her and let the full weight of 2 years of Harlow Street authority come into his voice. Lady, I don't think you understand what we do to people who... I understand exactly what you do. She looked at him with those flat, dark, unhurried eyes. I've watched you do it for 14 months. To Earl, to Patrice, to every person on this block who needed something from you and had nothing to negotiate with. A pause. I'm done watching. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Damon moved toward her from the left, and Trevor moved from the right, and Kashawn stood completely still with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the ground. Because something in the base of his brain, something older and more honest than ego or loyalty, was sending him a signal he had not felt in a long time. The signal was, do not be part of what happens next. Mia's livestream counter read 243. She still hadn't looked. Damon came from the left. That was his first mistake. Not because left was strategically worse than right, but because Vivienne had already cataloged him as the more impulsive of the two, the one who moved on feeling rather than calculation, who led with his arm before his feet were properly set. She had known that since the first shove. She had filed it away the way she filed everything quietly without ceremony, in the part of her mind that had been trained to turn observation into outcome. His hand came out reaching not a punch, not a strike, but a grab. Going for her jacket collar, trying to get a grip to physically redirect her the way you'd move furniture. It was the reach of someone who had never been seriously resisted. Someone who had built his entire understanding of physical confrontation on the assumption that size and aggression were sufficient. Vivienne didn't step back. She stepped into it. Her left hand came up and took his reaching wrist, not grabbing, not wrestling, just intercepting with precision, and she rotated at the hip in one controlled motion, using the momentum of his reach against him, redirecting it downward and across. The joint lock engaged before Damon's brain had finished processing that contact had been made. He went to one knee on the sidewalk with a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a word he didn't finish. 1. Trevor was already moving. He came forward the way big men with bad training always do, head slightly low shoulders, square weight committed entirely to forward momentum. Anger as fuel, mass as strategy. It had worked for him before. It worked because most people, when they see 210 pounds of committed aggression coming at them, get out of the way imperfectly, they stumble. They brace wrong, they absorb impact. They were trying to avoid. Vivienne sidestepped with a precision that looked almost lazy. She moved 4 inches to her right. Exactly 4, no more than necessary. And as Trevor's mass carried him through the space she had just vacated, she placed her left palm flat between his shoulder blades and assisted his momentum toward its natural conclusion. He hit the brick wall of Patrice's diner with his face turned just in time to take it on the cheekbone instead of the nose. The sound was solid and final, like a door closing hard. He didn't bounce. He didn't stagger dramatically. He simply stopped face against the brick and slid 6 inches before his knees caught him. 2. Vivienne stepped back. She positioned herself with her back to the diner wall, not cornered but anchored, and looked at Trevor, at Damon on one knee, at Kashawn across the sidewalk. The whole sequence had taken 7 seconds. She wasn't breathing hard. Her jacket was still straight on her shoulders. The sidewalk on Harlow Street went completely silent. Not the gradual quiet of a crowd losing interest. The sudden collective silence of people who have witnessed something that has rearranged their understanding of what was possible. 3 people stopped walking mid-stride. A woman with grocery bags stood with both hands gripping her handles, frozen at the edge of the scene. The barbershop's broken pole kept spinning. Everything else had stopped. Kashawn had not moved. He was standing exactly where he had been standing when Damon made his approach, and his hands were still in his pockets, and his face had gone the particular pale that faces go when adrenaline redirects all the blood somewhere more urgent. He was looking at Vivienne the way you look at something that has permanently altered your interior map of the world. Trevor pulled himself off the wall. His right cheekbone was going to be a deep, mottled bruise by afternoon. His eyes were bright with the specific fury of a man who has been publicly humiliated in the place where his authority lived. "You're dead," he said. The pleasantness was entirely gone from his voice. What was underneath it was raw and ugly and very serious. "You understand me? You are dead. I don't care if it takes me a week, I don't care." "Son." Vivienne's voice was quiet. He stopped talking, not because he wanted to, but because the quality of her voice left no room for anything else to exist alongside it. It was the voice of someone who had issued orders in darkness under fire, and it carried that history in every syllable without advertising it. 22 years, she said. Army Ranger. 3 deployments. I have put down men twice your size in the dark, in the rain, in conditions you could not survive for 48 hours. She looked at him steadily. You are not a threat. You are a child making noise in a place you think belongs to you. Trevor opened his mouth. The sirens cut him off. 1 unit, then a second, the sound pulling up hard from the south end of Harlow Street. Blue light strobed against the diner's yellow curtains. A patrol car stopped at the curb, and Officer Ray Delgado stepped out, 45 years old, 17 years on this beat. A man who had learned to read a scene the way a doctor reads a chart, quickly and without romanticism. He took in Trevor's face. Damon on one knee cradling his wrist. Kashawn motionless against the wall. Old Earl sitting on the sidewalk with one hand pressed to his elbow. Patrice in the diner doorway, dish towel still on her shoulder, phone in her hand. And then he looked at the woman standing at the center of all of it. He went very still. His mouth opened, his brow pulled together. 17 years of professional composure held, but only barely, only just. Vivienne Carter, The woman turned and looked at him, and recognized him. Ray Delgado had last seen Vivienne Carter at a community safety forum in DeKalb County 8 years ago. She had been sitting on a panel of 3, a retired detective, a community organizer, and she had spoken for exactly 4 minutes before the moderator had to gently suggest they move to the next panelist, because the audience had stopped looking at anyone else. She had talked about the relationship between neighborhood infrastructure and street-level crime in a way that made it feel obvious, inevitable, like she was describing the weather rather than proposing policy. Afterward, 3 city council aides had lined up to give her business cards. He had thought about that night a few times over the years. He had never thought he would find her here. He crossed the sidewalk toward her, and to his credit, he did not let his face become a thing that required her to manage. He kept it steady, kept it professional, and only the slight tightness at the corners of his eyes revealed anything at all. "It's Delgado," he said. "Ray Delgado. We met at the—" "I remember," Vivienne said. Her voice was even. "The forum. 2016. That's right." He nodded once slowly. Then he turned and addressed the full scene in the voice he used when a situation needed to understand that its next few minutes were going to be determined by him. "Everybody stays where they are. I need to understand what happened here." Trevor stepped forward immediately. His voice came out fast and lawyerly, already constructing the version of events that served him best. "She attacked us, officer. Unprovoked. My guys were just, sir." Delgado said the word the way you set something heavy on a table. "I haven't asked you anything yet." Trevor stopped. From across the street, a voice called out, "I've got the whole thing on video." Mia Torres walked forward from the far curb. Phone raised the screen facing outward. She had finally looked at the counter, 2,311 viewers. The number had hit her like cold water. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Everything," she said, "from when they kicked her box over. All of it." The sidewalk shifted. Not physically, but in the way that the distribution of weight in a room shifts when information enters it that cannot be unfiled. Trevor's expression changed in a way he could not entirely control. Damon, still on one knee, and now very focused on the pain in his wrist, rather than the situation around him, looked up at Mia with the expression of a man recalculating very quickly. Delgado crossed to Mia. He watched the video with the phone angled so that Trevor could not see the screen, but everyone else could see Delgado's face while he watched it. His jaw set, once, briefly, then relaxed back to professional neutral. He handed the phone back to Mia. "I'm going to need that footage preserved. Don't delete anything, don't edit anything. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Mia said. Delgado turned back to the group and made 2 decisions in rapid succession, the way he had learned to make decisions in situations that were still moving. First, he asked one of the arriving backup officers to check on old Earl, who was still sitting on the concrete alert, but clearly in pain, his right elbow bleeding in the thin, persistent way that older skin bleeds when it meets asphalt. Earl waved off the help, then accepted it anyway when the officer crouched beside him with a first aid kit and a matter-of-fact manner that didn't condescend to him. Second, he put Trevor Hollins and Damon in handcuffs. Trevor went loud. "This is insane." "She put my guy's wrist, Mr. Hollins." Delgado's voice did not rise. "You are being detained for investigation of assault, specifically the assault of an elderly man on a public sidewalk, which is on the video which I just watched, which will be part of the formal record. Anything you say from this point forward, I would strongly suggest you direct to an attorney." Trevor went quiet. The expression on his face was not quite fear, but it was the nearest neighbor to it. the dawning comprehension of a man who has operated for years in a space where consequences bent around him, suddenly feeling them straighten out. Kashan did not resist. He held his wrists out before he was asked. The officer who took him noted it and said nothing. Inside the diner, Patrice had guided Vivienne to a corner booth without making it feel like guidance. She set a fresh cup of coffee in front of her and sat down across from her the way people sit when they want to offer company without demanding anything from it. Vivienne looked at her hands on the table, both perfectly still. No tremor, no restlessness. The hands of someone who had returned from a thing they had been built to return from. "Are you all right?" Patrice asked. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. The diner smelled like coffee and butter and the particular warmth of a place that had been running long enough to have absorbed the people inside it into its walls. "I'm always all right," she said. Not a performance, not defiance. Just a fact delivered simply the way she delivered most things. Patrice nodded. She didn't push. She had learned across 14 months of 6 o'clock coffees and quiet mornings that this woman communicated in complete sentences only when complete sentences were necessary, and that silence from her was not absence but presence of a different kind. Outside, through the diner's yellow curtains, the livestream counter on Mia Torres's phone climbed past 4,000. Neither of them knew. Delgado came through the door 12 minutes later. He pulled out the chair across from Vivienne without asking and sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at her directly. "How long have you been out here, Vivienne?" She looked back at him without blinking. 14 months, she said. Something moved across Delgado's face that he did not try to hide this time. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the video had been watched 180,000 times. Mia Torres had not gone to school. She was sitting in the back booth of Patrice's place with her phone on the table in front of her and an untouched plate of eggs going cold at her elbow, watching the number climb with the particular stunned focus of someone who has thrown a stone into a lake and is watching the ripples reach the far shore. The clip had been edited by someone she didn't know, cut to 48 seconds, starting with Trevor's first kick and ending with Vivienne standing in the center of the sidewalk, duffel over her shoulder. 2 men incapacitated around her, the morning light catching the silver of her close-cropped hair. Someone had added no text, no music, no caption. They hadn't needed to. The image spoke in a language that did not require translation. Twitter, Reddit, TikTok, Facebook groups she had never heard of in cities she had never visited. The comments were a river that moved faster than she could read. Who is this woman? She didn't even break a sweat. Someone find her. Someone help her. This woman is living on the street, and nobody knew that flag in the Ziploc bag. I can't stop thinking about that flag. In Savannah, Georgia, in a house with a back porch that faced a live oak draped in Spanish moss, a 62-year-old man named Colonel James Whitmore, retired now, consulting for a veterans advocacy nonprofit, out of Atlanta, was sitting at his kitchen table with his second cup of coffee when his daughter sent him a text that said only Dad. Watch this. Now. He watched it twice. He set the cup down. That's Carter, he said to no one in particular. To the kitchen. To the morning. He picked up his phone and started making calls. The first was to a number he had for a contact at the VA regional office in Atlanta, a woman he had worked with before on benefits processing delays. A woman who understood that processing error was not an acceptable end to a sentence that began with 22 years of service. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. By the end of it, Vivienne Carter's stalled benefits file had been escalated to priority review. The second call was to a woman named Patricia Monroe. She answered on the first ring. Back on Harlow Street, the local news van arrived at 2:45. Then a second one. Patrice stood in her diner doorway and watched them set up on the sidewalk with the expression of a woman who had spent 11 months paying protection money to a man who was currently in a holding cell downtown and was still absorbing the fact that the world outside her block had apparently been watching. A reporter knocked on the glass. Patrice let her in. But when the reporter moved toward the back booth where Vivienne was sitting, Patrice stepped sideways into the path with the subtle effectiveness of someone who has run a small business for 20 years and understood that access was a resource you managed carefully. "She'll talk when she's ready," Patrice said. "You can wait." Vivienne talked at 3:15. She sat in the booth across from the reporter. A young black woman named Keisha Andres from Channel 11, who had the good sense to keep her notepad in her bag for the first 5 minutes and just listen. And she answered questions in the same way she did everything, without decoration, without performance, with complete economy of language. Her name, her years of service, the deployments. The Bronze Star, she mentioned it in passing. The way you mention a highway exit. What happened after? Robert's diagnosis, the bills, the house, the sequence of events that had brought her to a cardboard box on Harlow Street 14 months ago. Keisha Andres asked only one follow-up. "What do you want people to know about what happened this morning?" Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't want people to know about me. I want people to know about Earl." She nodded toward the window where old Earl was sitting on a bench outside his elbow, freshly bandaged, a cup of Patrice's coffee in his hand. "And Patrice, and every person on this block who has been living under that kind of fear for years and filing reports that went nowhere and paying money they couldn't afford to protect themselves from something the system was supposed to protect them from for free." She looked at the reporter steadily. "I'm not the story. They are." Keisha Andres wrote it down anyway. All of it, including that. The segment ran on the 6 o'clock news. By 6:30, the clip of Vivienne saying, "I don't want people to know about me," had been extracted and shared independently more than 40,000 times in the first hour. It spread faster than the fighting video. It traveled into different corners of the internet. It found people who had never watched a viral video in their lives and made them watch it twice. At 7:12 that evening, a black SUV pulled up in front of Patrice's place. Colonel James Whitmore stepped out. He was in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a gray quarter-zip, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked like someone's grandfather. He walked into the diner with the particular posture of a man who had spent 40 years being responsible for things that mattered and had not shed that weight in retirement, only redistributed it. He saw Vivienne in the back booth. He stopped. She looked up. The diner was quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when something true is happening inside them, something that doesn't need an audience and wouldn't change if it had one. "Sergeant Major Carter," Whitmore said. "Sir," Vivienne said. 8 seconds of silence. 22 years of shared history inside it. Whitmore sat down across from her. He put both hands on the table. He looked at her the way you look at something you are responsible for and did not adequately protect, and he did not look away from it. "We failed you," he said. "I failed you. The system failed you." His voice was steady, but it cost him something to keep it that way. "I need you to know that I know that." Vivienne was quiet for a long moment. "I should have asked for help sooner," she said. I know it's not all on me." She looked at him evenly. "But some of it is, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise." Whitmore held her gaze for a moment. Then he placed his phone face up on the table between them. The screen lit with a name. Senator Patricia Monroe, Armed Services Committee. Whitmore did not ask permission before making the call. That was not arrogance. It was the particular efficiency of a man who had spent 4 decades making decisions in windows that didn't stay open long, and who understood that the difference between a thing that happened and a thing that almost happened was usually 30 seconds and 1 phone call. He pressed the name on the screen and set the phone between them on the table, like a document being entered into evidence. Senator Patricia Monroe answered on the second ring. She was 61 years old, a Democrat from Georgia, chair of the Armed Services Committee's Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs, and the author of 2 pieces of legislation on military mental health funding that had both died in committee before finally passing on the 3rd attempt. She was not a woman who was easily surprised, but when Whitmore finished his 4-sentence summary of what had happened on Harlow Street that morning and who had been sleeping there for 14 months, and why she was quiet for long enough that Whitmore checked the phone to confirm the call was still connected, it was. "Get me her full file," Monroe said. "Benefits history, via correspondence, everything. I want it on my desk by morning." "Already requested," Whitmore said. Another brief pause. "James, is she there?" "She's sitting across from me." "Tell her," Monroe stopped, started again. "Tell her I'm sorry it took this long for anyone to pay attention." Whitmore relayed the message. Vivienne listened to it, with the same expression she carried for most things, attentive, unhurried, giving it its proper weight without performing a reaction. Then she said quietly, "Tell her attention is a start. Action is the part that matters." Whitmore told her. Monroe said, "Fair enough." The call ended at 7:44. By 8 o'clock, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution had confirmed it was running a front-page story for the morning edition. The reporter, a 38-year-old veteran affairs correspondent named Marcus Webb, had been working the veterans' homelessness beat for 6 years. When his editor sent him the video at 4 that afternoon, he had watched it once, closed his laptop, sat with his hands flat on his desk for about 45 seconds, then opened it back up and started making calls. By the time he reached Patrice's place at 8:15, he had already confirmed 3 key details independently: Vivienne's military record, the existence of the stalled VA benefits file, and the fact that Harlow Street's community police reports for the past 2 years contained 11 separate complaints referencing Trevor Hollins and his crew, none of which had resulted in any formal action. 11 complaints, 0 outcomes. He printed that number in the article, in its own sentence, with no additional commentary. The piece ran at 6 the next morning under the headline "Army Ranger Vet Living Homeless on Decatur Street. Video Goes Viral, System Failures Emerge." By 7:30, it had been shared 14,000 times. By noon, every major national outlet had picked it up. The details landed differently in print than they had in the video. The video had given people the image, the woman, the stillness, the 7 seconds. The article gave them the architecture behind it. $186,000 in medical debt. A benefits processing error that took 18 months to even acknowledge. A private security job lost to PTSD-related absences that the employer had no legal obligation to accommodate. A system that had taken 22 years of service, and then when the service was complete, had simply stopped looking. The hashtag Find Vivienne Carter had trended for approximately 3 hours the previous afternoon, before being replaced by hashtag We Found Vivienne Carter. A shift that carried its own complicated weight because she had never been lost. She had been on Harlow Street. She had been visible. The block had known where she was. The country had just not been looking at Harlow Street. By mid-morning, a GoFundMe had been started by Mia Torres, who had not slept, who was running on gas station coffee, and the focused, terrified energy of someone who had accidentally become the center of a national news story and was trying to be worthy of it. Mia had written the campaign description at 2 a.m, deleting and rewriting 4 times before landing on something that felt honest rather than performative. Her name is Vivienne Carter. She served this country for 22 years. She has been sleeping outside on Harlow Street in Decatur for 14 months. She doesn't need your pity. She needs a floor to stand on. The rest she'll handle herself. By 11 that morning, the campaign had raised $47,000. Mia stared at the number for a long time. Then she texted her mother, who called back in 30 seconds and said nothing for the first 8 of them. The legal consequences moved with the particular momentum that builds when video evidence is unambiguous and public attention is total. Trevor Hollins and Damon were charged with criminal assault in the 2nd degree for Old Earl, whose elbow had sustained a hairline fracture in the fall, along with extortion charges that emerged from a secondary investigation opened that same afternoon when Patrice Nguyen walked into DeKalb County Police Headquarters at 9 a.m. and placed a formal written statement on the front desk. 11 months of payments, $400 a month, documented in a notebook she had kept in the drawer under her register because she told the detective, "I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I knew I needed to write it down." She was not the only one. By the end of the day, 6 other business owners on Harlow Street had come forward with their own statements. Some of them had been paying Trevor for longer than Patrice had. One of them, the owner of the nail salon, had been paying for 3 years and had never once believed that stopping was a real option. She said when the detective asked her why she was coming forward now, because she stood up. She did not need to explain who she meant. The courtroom in DeKalb County was not large. It held perhaps 80 people in the gallery, with wooden benches that had absorbed decades of difficult mornings and showed it in their surfaces worn smooth in the center. Rough at the edges, the way things get when they have been used seriously for a long time. The overhead lights were fluorescent and institutional and made everyone look slightly more tired than they actually were. Vivienne Carter sat in the 3rd row on the left side behind the prosecutor's table. She wore dark slacks and a navy blazer that Patrice had pressed for her that morning, without being asked, producing it from the back of a closet with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who understood that certain moments required certain things, and that offering the resource directly was more useful than asking whether it was needed. Vivienne had accepted it the same way she accepted most things from Patrice, without ceremony, with a nod that communicated more than a paragraph would have. Her back was straight. Her hands were in her lap. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had sat in difficult rooms before, and understood that your posture in a room communicated something about how much the room owned you. Trevor Hollins was at the defendant's table. He had a lawyer, a young man in a suit that was slightly too large across the shoulders, doing his professional best with a case that the evidence had made very simple. Trevor himself was wearing a collared shirt that someone had pressed, and he sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression of a man who had decided that attitude was the one thing left that couldn't be taken from him. He did not look at Vivienne when he came in. Then he did. Once briefly, before he looked away. She looked back at him with those flat, dark, unhurried eyes, and something moved across his face that was not quite the emotion he would have chosen to display in public. His attorney touched his arm. He turned back toward the front of the room. The proceedings were efficient. The evidence was not complicated. Mia Torres's video had been entered into the record in full, all 4 minutes and 31 seconds of it, from the first kick through the arriving sirens. It had been watched by the judge, by both attorneys, by the jury that had been selected 2 days prior, and by the court reporter, who had kept her expression entirely neutral throughout, and then when it was over, straightened her papers in a way that was just slightly more deliberate than usual. Patrice Nguyen testified for 22 minutes. She sat in the witness box with her hands folded on the rail and described 11 months of payments in the level precise manner of someone who had spent a year rehearsing this conversation in her head during the quiet hours before the diner opened. She did not editorialize. She did not raise her voice. She stated amounts, dates, and the specific threats that had accompanied each demand. And she looked at the jury while she did it rather than at Trevor because she had decided in advance that she was done letting that man occupy her direct line of sight more than was absolutely necessary. When the defense attorney asked on cross-examination whether she had ever formally documented these payments at the time they were made, she reached into her jacket pocket and produced a small green notebook. 43 entries. Dates, amounts, and a brief description of what had been said by whom. The attorney looked at the notebook. He sat back down. Old Earl testified for 9 minutes seated because his elbow was still in a soft brace. He described being pushed. He described the ground coming up at him. He described the particular sound his body had made when it landed and the way that sound had felt from the inside, and the 7 seconds he had spent afterward trying to determine whether anything was broken before deciding that it probably was. He said all of this without anger and without self-pity in the voice of a man reporting facts, and when he was done, he folded his hands in his lap and waited to be excused with the patience of someone who had been waiting for things for a very long time. Kashan testified for the prosecution. He had accepted his cooperation agreement quietly and completely, the way he had stood on the sidewalk that morning, understanding before everyone else that the situation had moved beyond the point where posturing was a viable strategy. He described the extortion operation in detail, which businesses paid how much, how often, what happened to businesses that refused. He named 4 other individuals connected to Trevor's crew who had participated in collection runs. He did not look at Trevor while he testified. Trevor's attorney made his arguments. The judge listened with the attentiveness of someone who had already formed a view and was giving the process its proper due. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 14 minutes, which included a lunch break. The verdict was not complicated. Trevor Hollins guilty on all counts. The sentence handed down was 4.5 years with eligibility for parole review at the 30-month mark contingent on participation in a mandated intervention program. The judge made a point before concluding of noting for the record that 11 formal complaints had been filed regarding the defendant's conduct in the preceding 2 years, and that the absence of any prior action on those complaints represented a failure of the system that the court wished to formally acknowledge. Damon received 3 years. Kashan received a suspended sentence and 200 hours of community service plus mandatory counseling, which the judge described not as a gift, but as a responsibility. "You knew," she said, looking at him directly. "Use that knowledge for something worth doing." Kashan nodded. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it. Afterward, in the corridor outside the courtroom, a reporter caught Vivienne as she was walking toward the exit and asked the question she had been asked in various forms for the past 2 weeks. "What do you want people to take away from all of this?" She stopped walking. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then she said, "With that what happened to me could happen to anyone who falls far enough and fast enough that the systems designed to catch people can't find them in time. And that when one person stands up in a place where people have been told to keep their heads down, it changes the geometry of the whole street." A pause. "Don't wait for someone else to stand up first." She walked out into the afternoon. Harlow Street changed the way streets change when the thing that was wrong with them is finally removed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. The awnings were still faded, the sidewalk still cracked in the same places the barbershop pole still spun with its broken habitual persistence. The check-cashing place on the corner was still there, still never seemed to close. The vacant lot was still a vacant lot. The unfinished construction still unfinished, still patient in the way that abandoned things are patient. But the air on the block was different. People noticed it without being able to fully articulate it. The owners of the small businesses, the residents of the apartments above them, the people who walked through on their way to somewhere else. A loosening. The particular quality of a space where something that had been held tight for a long time had finally been allowed to release. Patrice Nguyen noticed it most on the mornings when she unlocked the diner at 5 and did not feel the low, persistent dread that had accompanied that act for 11 months. She opened the door. She turned on the lights. She started the coffee. That was all it was. That was everything it was supposed to be, and the absence of the fear that had attached itself to those simple actions for so long felt in the first weeks almost disorienting, like the phantom weight of a thing you had carried, until your body forgot what it was like to walk without it. She hired a second cook in October. She extended her hours on Fridays. She bought new curtains still yellow, because some things don't need to change. Old Earl moved into the Claremont Road Transitional Housing Facility in the third week of September. He had a room with a window that faced east, which meant the light came in the mornings in a way that he described to Vivienne the first time she visited as almost worth everything it took to get here. He had a milk crate in the corner. He had transferred it himself from Harlow Street, carried it on the bus, set it in the corner of his room, and sat on it for about 5 minutes before putting it under the window as a plant stand instead. He grew a small cactus on it. It required almost no maintenance and was extremely difficult to kill. He felt it suited him. Mia Torres's GoFundMe reached $214,000 before Vivienne asked her gently, but without ambiguity, to close it. She had done the math on what she actually needed the deposit and first month's rent on a one-bedroom apartment in East Atlanta, 3 months of covered living expenses, while the VA benefits were processed and reinstated, and one suit for what was coming next, and the number was considerably less than $214,000. She directed the remaining funds to the Honor Home Foundation, a nonprofit that specialized in housing placement for homeless female veterans. She did this without a press release, without a statement, without announcing it on any of the platforms that had been waiting for her to announce things. The foundation's director found out from a bank notification and called Whitmore, who called Delgado, who told Patrice, who nodded once and said, "That sounds exactly right," and went back to her coffee. Senator Monroe held a public hearing on veterans' homelessness in Atlanta in November. Vivienne testified. She wore her old dress uniform. It still fit. She was built the way she had always been built, in the specific physical language of someone whose body had been a professional instrument for more than 2 decades. She sat at the long table facing the committee panel, and she adjusted the microphone, and she waited for the room to settle, and then she spoke for 11 minutes without notes. She talked about the benefits processing delay. She talked about PTSD and the particular difficulty of asking for help when your entire professional identity had been built around not needing it. She talked about the gap between the systems that were supposed to support veterans and the actual experience of navigating those systems at the lowest point of your life. She was specific. She was precise. She was not angry, because anger was not the most effective tool for this room, and she knew how to select the right tool for the terrain she was on. At the end, Senator Monroe leaned forward toward her microphone. "Sergeant Major Carter, in your assessment, what is the single most important change this committee could make?" Vivienne considered the question. "Fund the floor," she said. "Don't give veterans charity. Give them stability housing, healthcare continuity benefits processed in real time, rather than 18 months after the fact. Give them a floor to stand on." She paused. "They'll build the rest themselves. That's what we trained them to do." The room was quiet. Then it wasn't. She moved into her apartment in East Atlanta on the 1st of October. A one-bedroom on the 3rd floor, east-facing windows, a small kitchen with a gas stove. She spent the first evening arranging the few things she owned with the methodical care she brought to all arrangements, and when it was done, she made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet, and let the quiet be what it was. In the morning, she rose at 5:30. She made the bed with hospital corners. She set her few belongings in their proper order. Then she stood at the east window and watched the light come into Atlanta the way it comes into all cities, indifferently, generously, making no distinction between the places it touched, and she felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Not relief. Something more durable than either of those things. 3 weeks later, Officer Ray Delgado drove his patrol car slowly down Harlow Street on an early Tuesday morning. The diner's lights were already on. The smell of coffee reached the cracked window of his car. The sidewalk was clean and still. The barbershop pole was spinning. He stopped the car at the curb. He sat for a moment, looking at the block the way you look at something you have watched for a long time and are only now fully seeing. Then he nodded once to no one in particular. To the street. To the morning. He put the car in drive and continued on.
Vivienne Carter never asked to be seen. She asked for nothing from the street that took her in, and she gave it something it hadn't had in years, the sight of a person who refused, under every pressure available, to let go of their own dignity. Dignity is not given by circumstance. It is held. It is a decision made every single morning, regardless of what the night before looked like. If this story moved something in, you drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this one need to travel. Share it, subscribe if you haven't, and stay close, because the next story we're telling is one you are not going to want to miss.